Hey, everybody, it's Martin here. And I just wanted to talk to you for a minute before you listen to our episode, A New Man. This is the second part, and it's called Masculinity in America. We hope you enjoyed part one last week, The Pain That Lingers. Today, Dustin, Mahdi, and myself are going to be talking about the messages that we received about what it meant to be a man. And it's a pretty open conversation. We definitely are not trying for something that is elite or teaching, but we really wanted to just get raw and share with you all as we share with each other. So sit back and enjoy. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Soul Focused Radio. This is your host, Martin Friedman, and I am super excited today to be joined by my brothers at Soul Focused Group, Mahdi and Dustin. What's happening, you guys?
Man, we're doing good, doing good. Good to hear your voice, Teddy Bear Moses. And look, everybody, just want everybody to just call me M. And I want to just say, we want to thank you for your support. This podcast has really been blowing up around the globe, and it's because of your support and your help. Thank you. We do this because we love you.
No doubt, no doubt. I'm just excited to be able to be on and have this conversation with the both of you. It's very rare we get on a podcast together, so I'm looking forward to this time we're about to spend.
Awesome.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. Yeah. No, 100%. This is a great conversation we're about to have. So for our listeners, as you say, Mahdi or M, we'll try to get in the habit of saying M. If we call you M, then we have to call me MF. So it's. I'm not sure I'm ready to. I'm not sure I'm ready to bring myself out into the world like that 100%. But
well, let me tell you how I came to be called M. Right?
Sure.
It's from Starbucks. I go to Starbucks a lot. Well, I used to go to Starbucks a lot, right? You go up to the counter, they always want to ask you your name. And I'm like, man, I tell them my name and they always mispronounce it, misspell it. Man, F this stuff, man. Just call me M. Mm-hmm. And M has stuck. So, I'm in front of audiences. I say, just call me M. And for some reason, it's so easy to remember. Everybody calls me M. So M it is.
Hey, bro, I know how that is. I know how that is. You say Mahdi and they're like, Marvin?
Exactly.
No, Mahdi. I know, man. I go through the same thing, bro. I'll just be like, George, you just call me George. I don't care. Just give me my coffee.
Just give me my coffee, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that origin story. Cause I think a lot of people, when they hear you say M, they probably think it's this deep spiritual piece, right? Mahdi,
you can thank Starbucks for that shit.
Beautiful.
And your name is?
Yeah. And it's happened to me a lot. It's happened to me a lot too. So I want us to jump into this conversation, let our audience know that we're starting this series today. And when we say series, it's not like a teaching series. This is going to be a series of conversations, and these conversations are really going to revolve around, our stories, and we're going to have some special guests on here talking about the stories. And what we want to talk about is we want to talk about masculinity in America. Masculinity in America.
We really want to take you into the hearts of men, into our hearts, and open it so that you can see what's in the hearts of men. Because I think men are misunderstood. I think men misunderstand themselves. For years, I misunderstood myself and my masculinity. And so together, we're going to be diving into this so that we can help each other reveal who men really are.
Right. And like you said, Mahdi, that's for us too, for us revealing in ourselves. And we want everybody to know this is going to be a no holds barred, raw conversation. Like there's no place we really don't want to go with this. We want to have open, honest, transparent conversations.
Yes.
And
you agree with that, Dustin? You agree, Dustin?
Oh yeah, I'm 100% with you. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to jump right in.
And so that means that folks might hear, might hear things that might upset people, or, could be some, how did you say it before, Mahdi, some language that, might feel offensive to people, but we're just letting folks know ahead of time. It's a little bit of a disclaimer that, this is going to be a raw conversation.
Yeah, I think if you have problems, being able to hear some of those bombs we may be dropping, you may not want to listen to this. But if you really want to know what's in the heart of a man, and you want to know what's in our heart and the struggles that we've been through, then you may have to survive some of these bombs we may drop.
Right. That's right. I think there's a lot of fear out there right now, right? Like today's topic is, we want to talk about, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a man? And I think there's a lot of fear in a lot of us right now that if we say the wrong thing, that there's a level of pushback that we'll get if we say things that people, might not be comfortable with. And I think there's, for a lot of men right now, there's fear in expressing what does it really mean to us to be a man.
The crazy thing about it is that, this is like the chickens coming on the roost, right? Because the truth is, men have been defining the reality, right? So the reality, the way we defined it, has finally caught up with us. And life itself, the universe, is forcing our hand to evolve to a higher level. And we can't do that unless we sort of re-examine how we've been being. And to be honest, and be really honest and transparent about it with ourselves and each other. Because, I mean, you're right, Martin, the fear is real about being afraid to say certain things. Because we're living in a world now where people are holding one another responsible for the things that we've said without giving any thought to it at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I really want to ground this in our stories. And, Dustin, I'd like to start with you. I have a question for you. And I really want to know from you, when is the first time that you ever remember being told that you needed to act like a man? What's the first time you can ever remember hearing those words where somebody said, Dustin, you need to act like a man?
Yeah, I remember hearing those words very explicitly around 5 or 6 years old. And it was from my stepfather. And I was upset, emotionally upset, crying about something. And I remember him vividly saying, men don't cry. And him going on to say, if you keep crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about. What he was talking was he was going to whoop me, right?
Whoop your ass, right?
Whoop my ass, right? So I didn't, at that point, I stopped crying, of course, because I didn't want to get whooped. But that moment clearly stayed with me, that I can now recall that memory at 50 years old, that moment, so 44 years ago stays with me vividly. So very quickly, I internalized any show of emotion as a male was frowned upon and not man-like. And, of course, that was reinforced by every male around me, both adults as well as my peers, like if you cried on the playground, you would get called sissy or even faggot. I mean, it was, that was reinforced very, very quickly. And so, that was my first memory, Martin.
And of course, back then, the terminology, in terms of socialization, and when you say faggot or sissy, that was like common language at that time. And, and it wasn't looked upon as being positive either. So, in terms of how it was then,
Right. And those words were thrown around like candy, I mean, nobody had any problem with those words. Those were
no filters, no filters
whatsoever, man. No filters whatsoever.
Because, I don't think, I know for a fact, like people I grew up around, they weren't consciously aware of gay people. It was just negative connotations about people who were gay. And it wasn't like there was no consciousness to it at all. And that's why it come off so damaging and so hurtful,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely experienced the same thing. Growing up where I grew up, it was those words were thrown around all the time, and it didn't have anything to do with your sexuality, but it definitely was a commentary on, how much of a man or your masculinity, I would say. I know for me, when people were calling me that, they were using it to put me down in the context of sports or just different things like that. That's how I remember it being used.
Yeah, it's like, it was their way of saying you're less than.
Exactly.
You're going to be less than a man. because Dustin's story is similar to my story. I remember, when I was maybe about 6 or 7, I was empathic. I've always been empathic, and as a child, I didn't know what to do with that because I didn't know that's what it was. But I used to feel very intensely for people, and I remember one day I was crying because I was feeling sorry or I had feelings for another human being that was in a bad situation. And one of my uncles noticed me crying, and he says, "Boy, what you crying about?" And I told him. He says, "Boy, if you don't stop all that crying, you're gonna grow up to be nothing but a punk."
Mm.
And I remember like, whoa, the intensity of that word being used, made me start suppressing my sensitivity because I was a very sensitive child, not in a sense where I was like, out of control, but in the sense to where I really felt for people. And my compassion was very deep. And after that day, I remember it slowly being me slowly pushing it in, holding it back because I didn't feel like it was safe to really be that way. So I could just imagine, a child who is non-binary, you know, how that would have landed on them, and how dangerous that could have been.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because that was, I mean, in many ways, we were told that was the worst thing you could be, right? So
Yeah,
even if people didn't say to you, like, act like a man in those words, and I know you both heard those, those words explicitly. I didn't really hear those words explicitly. I know that especially my grandfather, who was definitely the more dominant, like, patriarch in my life, he would talk to me about all that. Like there was a lot of stuff around, my hair couldn't get touch the tops of my ears. He would yell at my dad if he saw me and my hair was below the tops of my ears because that looked feminine to him. He hated hippies. My grandfather had a lot of hate in him. He hated black people. He hated women. But the person that he hated the most was a hippie, a white male hippie, because he just hated the thought to him of like basically, that's what he relied on. He relied on that what he read as masculinity. He relied on that for his self-esteem, and so he hated when he saw a boy or a man with long hair, and
right.
it was like intense. So I never heard that terminology. I didn't have experiences like you all had in terms of, people really, men in my life, like, threatening me physically around, me not being masculine enough, but it was still very, very strong in terms of what came from the men in my family, especially my grandfather, more so than my dad for sure.
I want to say this. I say this all the time to people that I coach. Since I've been coaching for 30 years, is that the idea of if you go back into your past and you criticize yourself for what you did in the past based upon what you know today is cruel and unusual punishment. Because there's no way you could have done anything differently back then based upon the knowledge that you were running off of, right? So I say that to people as you're listening to this, as we go back, we're not trying to criticize, but we're just examining with a fresh eye of how things influence us and what socialization we receive that put us on our path to becoming the men that we have been and the men that we are now.
I'm so happy you said that, Mahdi, because, it is definitely a moment for a sober examination of gender constructs and what we were taught to be a man and how that has showed up in many ways that has kept us from being our authentic selves. So when you talk about being an empath, that's a beautiful thing. There's everything about that is beautiful, but to have that being shut down because other people were projecting what they were conditioned and taught, in many ways could have kept you from ever really expressing that in life. Many people don't get to the point of moving past the messages and the barriers that were established psychologically, emotionally, and then come back to really express their authentic self. And, for us, I mean, we've been having this conversation around racism for the majority of our life. We could talk about racism in all its nuances in a very intimate and direct way, in a complex way often. But we haven't, as a movement, at least a majority of men that I've known in the movement, including us, really spent a lot of time examining how the messages we received around your question, Martin, what does it mean to be a man?
Right.
Sometimes I think about like how uncomfortable that they probably felt with me being sensitive, with me demonstrating like a deep concern and compassion for other people in ways that they weren't accustomed to from other guys, and how uncomfortable it might have made them feel because more than likely they had learned to suppress their feelings too at a very young age. And
Right.
so I think in some ways they had associated, my uncles had associated you expressing that as negative. And it's almost like a rite of passage. You have to suppress your feelings because we suppressed ours. And
Right.
that's what was like a rite of passage of becoming a man. That's all they knew. It was like making your feelings an enemy, you know? So you become delinquent in your ability to express them and convey them over to other people because you have a very confused relationship with your feelings.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate everything that you all both just said. And I think the motivation, right, for what you just talked about, the motivation in many ways, all of the examples that we just gave, and I know we all have a lot more examples, but all of those examples came, my understanding, they came from a place of love, that the men in our lives were trying to protect us, right?
No
That,
doubt, no doubt.
because I hear you saying there's a rite of passage, but part of the rite of passage is like you're taught early what it means to be a man, to not, be soft, to not show weakness. And I also want to highlight too, I think all three of us on this call really share that sensitivity. I think all three of us in our own ways were extremely highly sensitive, still are. But, I know for me, I think one of the things that for me is coming up real, early in this conversation very strongly is also just the different racial dynamics in what you all experience and what I experienced. I'm not saying that there aren't white boys or white men that went through what you all did. I think there's class probably at play to a certain extent, and race, both in the stories. But for me, I got all the same messages, but just not directly, not told to me directly, and not told to me with the intensity that I hear you all talking about it.
Right. It's just so much. And I'm glad you had said, the idea that essentially it's not all bad because they did it out of love. And there were a lot of positive things that came out of that socialization. But at the same time, as we look back on it, we see the impact it could have. Right. And I'm not in no way like putting my uncles down for doing the best that they could do based upon the technology that they were dealing with at that time. Technology, what it meant to be a black man in America. Technology, when I say technology, I'm talking about the thinking that they had been socialized to use and to have growing up in quote unquote the ghetto, right? So to survive the ghetto, you know, they knew that they had to fight. So I was gonna have to fight. In fact, there was one time where, I walked away from a fight and they found out and they brought me to the fight and made me fight the guy. And so I remember, Martin, you had asked me earlier when we were talking about it, and you says, what did you learn from that? I learned from that. No, you asked me, did it ever happen again? I was like, hell no, because after the first time it happened, I knew if I walked away from any fight, what was going to happen. So I always stood up to every fight. Now, that gave me a positive lesson in life to not run away from your challenges and to stand up to them. It's just unfortunate that it had to have violence to be a part of it. But I took from there and applied that lesson to other parts of my life where I didn't run from anything. Anything I felt afraid of, I would face. And I learned that lesson from them. So that was the positive side of that very confusing and suppressive way of expressing what I felt inside myself.
Well, we all listened to a podcast recently of two black parents talking, and the father talked about, his dad waking him up at 6, 7 years old, taking him out to wash the car. And he really didn't understand why his dad was doing that until his dad told him, I'm doing this because in this life, in the skin that you're in the gender that you hold, and all that means to be a black man in America, you're going to have to do things and you can never show how that makes you feel emotionally. So when you talk about your uncle seeking to protect you, it makes me think, Mahdi, about things that get passed down multi-generationally through our nervous system. And so think about in slavery, we weren't able to show our emotions. And in segregation, the degradation we receive, being told we couldn't look white men in the eyeball, or having to sit in, certain seats in restaurants, or not even being allowed in restaurants, coming to the back door, all that stuff. There was no place to express emotion because that could be a life and death scenario. And so having the conversation around Black men and emotional expression without having a historical framework and context, which we often do in our society, ends up being a very damaging conversation that continues to polarize us. So I just wanted to add that to what you said. That just sparked a very deep thought in my mind.
Right. No human being grows and matures in the vacuum. There are all sorts of circumstances that contribute to who they become. And, you may not, some things you may not like about it, and you may want to try to cancel it. But the reality is they wouldn't be who they are now if those experiences did not unfold. I wouldn't be who I am now if it weren't for my uncles. I'm very, very clear about it. There's no way I could be who I am right now to this day if it weren't for my uncles, because they gave me all sorts of examples of what to do, examples of what not to do. The people that come before you are models. They're modeling, the right way and the wrong way. And it's up to you to apply it in a way that works to you becoming healthy. One of the biggest things I learned was I had one of my cousins who was jealous of me, and he admitted to that. He thought I had something that I didn't have. We were basically in the same situation. So one day, because I was the star on the football team, high school football team, he wanted to fight me, and he wanted to fight me in front of a whole lot of people. And I said, I said to everybody, I don't want to fight in front of everybody. I said, let's go in the locker room and have the coaches lock the door, and just me and you in the locker room. Whoever comes out, that's the best man. So we get put in the locker room. As soon as the doors close, he says to me, man, I don't want to fight you, cuz. I don't want to fight you. Man, forget about all that. It was then I learned how performative masculinity has been. Very performative. And so many things that we found ourselves doing, we did to please the crowd. You take the crowd away, and a large degree of masculinity goes away. And then you get to what I feel like is like the bottom line of what it really means to be a man. And it has very little to do with your genitalia. Very little to do with your testosterone. I think it's more about what you take on, what you accept responsibility for. And you see very little of that.
Man, so many things are coming up for me. Going back to your original question of what it means to be a man and how emotions get shut down. My grandfather, who raised me my whole life, and who's been the most important man in my life, was probably the most emotionally shut down man that I know. He only cried that I know of 3 times. Once when I was 15 and I went to rehab, he bawled like a baby. Second, when his brother died, he fell into my arms crying, which was devastating for me because I didn't see the first time he cried. I just heard about that. And then just recently I was back in New Jersey, and there was some emotional dynamics going on in the family. And he came outside. He has Alzheimer's. And so, of course, with Alzheimer's, you're regressing back in many ways to what it was like to be a child. And he cried like a baby over an emotional interaction with my grandmother and my mother. And one of the things that just made me realize that this is an emotionally expressive man, but all the messages that he received in this world told him never to express that. And so I can see the physical cost and the mental cost on what that repression has done. And for him to be able to emotionally let that out in this moment was only because of his Alzheimer's. And it just what's sitting with me is we understand, Mahdi, you explained the context of the why. We're talking about the context of the why, but also really locking in on what the cost has been to us.
It has been a serious problem. I'm going to tell you something. My dad never told me he loved me. Never. Now, did I know that my daddy loved me? I could say, yeah. I could say I told myself that he did. But I remember one situation that told me that it was like an example that he loved me. And there was one time I skipped school with one of my uncles. And I'm playing basketball on the playground. He drives up, finds out I skipped school. For some reason, he called the school. I don't know why he called the school. He would never call the school. And they told him that I didn't show up that day. So he pulls up on the basketball court. I'm playing with all the guys that had dropped out of school. I'm out there playing ball with him. He slams his hand on the side of the door and tells me to get in. So of course he tells me when I get in the car, when I get home, he's gonna whip my ass. We get home, he takes off his belt, tells me to bend over, and before he hits me with the belt, he says, "Listen, this is gonna hurt me more than hurt you." And I said to myself, "Yeah, man, yeah, right." I bent over, he hit me with the belt one time, and everything stopped. I'm like, "What's taking so long, man? Let's get this shit over with." I turned around, he was bawling like a baby. My first time ever seeing him cry about anything. And that for me was my sort of like proof, confirmation that he loved me, because when he said, this would hurt him more than it hurt me, I wondered about it. I said, damn, it really hurt, because I never saw him cry for nothing. That was the only time I saw him cry. So I had that memory held, because he's no longer with me, in my brain, that I knew he loved me because he cried, and he never cried for nothing. So I held on to that. But imagine having to sift through morsels, looking for breadcrumbs in your life to identify with or to validate your appearance and your being here. Because men, we come up like gladiators, right? Built for war, built for violence, and then we're gone. Because we live very short lives. And it's because of the programming. It's because of how we built and what we are taught to be. My dad died at 59.
We really hope you enjoyed listening to the stories that we were all sharing on this episode. I think Mahdi left us at a very powerful place, talking about his father and the impact that it had on his life and on his death. In our next episode, we will talk more about how race informs our different experiences with masculinity. I will kick off the next episode with a story of my relationship with my father, which has both similarities and differences to Mahdi's and Dustin's stories. So we are so excited that you're on this journey with us. We can't wait to meet you. Hopefully soon the world opens up and we can meet you in person. If not, we want to meet you virtually. We're excited that you're taking this journey with us, specifically around what it means to be a man. This is a conversation that in our circles we haven't had nearly enough, not in such a raw and vulnerable way. So thank you for being with us. We want you to stay safe. We want you to stay well. And most of all, and most importantly, we want you to stay soul focused.